Welcome back, folks. It's 11 and a half minutes past 6 o'clock, and we have Mr. David Abdulah. He's the political leader of the MSJ, and he's here to discuss and bring some clarity to the whole issue of what's happening with those cross-border and across-the-border gas reserves and oil reserves with regard to our relationship with Venezuela. Sir, welcome to Morning Edition.
Morning, Hayden. Good to be here.
Did you make it to any of the events over the weekend? You had Pan Semis, you had the Chutney Soca Monarch.
I was in Panorama yesterday. Got there just about 4 and left there a little after 9. So I didn't hear all the bands, heard some of them on radio.
Yeah.
But you know, moving around. The crowd turned out, you know, in large numbers on the stretch. I didn't go in the stands, on the stretch and so on.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say which band I didn't hear all the bands, so I can't be a judge. But I could tell you which ones I thought sounded really
But
good.
it seems as though the Pan City concept that was developed by Pan Tobago for this year, it seems as though that was better received by the patrons.
I don't know. I didn't get that close.
Yeah.
I didn't get close.
I saw some of
the
another station did some interviews with some of the patrons, and of course patrons still yearn for the return of the North Stand.
Yes.
But I suppose this is all part of the evolution of the product that is Pan Semis, and then of course the Pan Finals and so on. But we had a great discussion during the week last week regarding the Carnival as a product.
Yes.
And what we're doing to really enhance this product, make it a lot more attractive for tourists and for locals as well. And I dare say the consensus is that there's a lot to be done, a lot more to be done, you know.
Well, you know, when I was president of FITER and Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs at the time, this would have been, time flies by, it was about 17 years ago, 15 years ago, in conjunction with one of the member organizations at the time, which was the East Port of Spain Council of Community Organizations. We developed a whole plan to make East Port of Spain a heritage city, so that there would be permanent spaces for tents, for calypso of vintage years, for people to be tuning pans. So you have a cruise ship where one got blanked a short while.
They blocked the Caribbean Princess.
But for people coming in on a cruise ship to be able to go see how a pan is being tuned, buy a pan, buy CDs, and so on, see what calypso tents were like, and so on, buy music, and then you have food and everything else surrounding it, mass costumes and so on.
Yeah.
So that we need to have that kind of space created, and that has to be a government intervention. Of course, people who are then operating it may be private and so on, but you have to have that government intervention, together with a Carnival museum, which is not only in terms of real touch things, but also virtual, so people could see mass of years gone by, calypso, years gone by, pan, and so on, see costumes, all of that. And so there are things that people can go to, and not only in terms of tourists, but also Trinidad and Tobago citizens who don't know
that history. And I dare say that, look, change, you know. So many ideas that have been, you know, just blowing in the wind. And we can't seem to put any of these ideas really into action. I suppose it's really about leadership too. And I'm glad you're here this morning, because the issue of leadership, we seem to be dropping the ball. Every 5 years, there's the promise of change, the promise of transformation. We will solve crime in 6 months. Give me 6 months, I will solve crime, and so on. And yet, the populace of Trinidad and Tobago is constantly being disappointed by this political directorate that is rotating, oscillating between PNM and UNC and so on. When are we going to build the courage as a nation to step away from the identity politics?
To break that cycle.
To break that cycle and embrace the promise of good policy and demand accountability.
Well, there are several factors. One, of course, is when enough people decide to step away from their traditional culture of race politics, because that is part of it, race and religion, and geography and so on. I think that critical mass of people willing to break or not wanting to be caught up in that old politics, that critical mass is growing. The challenge, of course, is to get them excited enough to support an alternative.
Yes.
Because the truth of the matter is that the PNM and the UNC, neither of them are going to break out of the old political mold of decision making. It's not only about the nature of their politics, but their politics in government is to maintain the status quo. We have to change and break up the status quo in this country, you know.
Do you see
in many dimensions?
As you look at the elections data over the years, do you see the emergence of more marginal constituencies as really an indicator that people are really thinking outside of the box? They're willing to take a risk and effect some kind of change at the level of their constituency?
I'm not sure it's purely a matter of people willing to do something different as much as it's also the change in demographics of some of those constituencies, either by way of changes in the electoral boundaries and or population shifts and so on, which have evened out the numbers of hardcore PNM, hardcore UNC, which therefore means that in those constituencies there will be a swing vote that can shift it one way or the other. The issue, though, has to be not to swing it one way or the other back to PNM or back to UNC,
right,
but really is to break the mold completely.
I suppose we do this thing in steps, and of course, I see sometimes you suspect that political parties are using the HDC, the housing program, as a means of effecting that demographic shift in their favor when they're in office.
When they're in office, of course. And it's not only that. I mean, the other factor in the politics is money. Big money. And so elections has almost become a commodity. Media houses make tons of money, some of them, right, by way of advertisement. But then there's also people on the ground who will say, well, you want my vote? You have to run something.
Right.
So people exchange their vote for dollars and cents and cell phone, whatever it is, a bottle of alcohol. So elections has very much become a commodity, and that is something that we also have to break, because it then means that a few people with a lot of money can really determine who is in government.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a straight line, because in the local elections, for example, last time, the PNM spent a lot of money in advertisement, but that didn't necessarily win them the election.
Right.
Similarly, in 2015, the UNC spent tons of money, and that didn't win them the elections either. So it's not a straight line, but money does count in these elections, and that is also undermining the real democracy of the country.
But you know, we say this every 5 years, that there is an inherent need for campaign financing reform. And yet our parliamentarians just turn a blind eye to all of this. And it is not a priority when you consider the parliamentary agenda. It is not a campaign financing reform, fixed terms for the Prime Minister, a fixed date for the general elections and other local government elections and so on. These constitutional issues just seem to fall by the wayside. There is some talk about it on the platform and so on, but yet when people get into office, it then loses its luster as a campaign commodity.
Yeah, because once you have power, then those things of accountability, transparency, better governance really work against you maintaining power. Absolutely. Take the public procurement legislation, for example.
Yeah.
That ought to have been fully implemented ages ago.
Yeah.
Why is it taking so long? Because obviously without public procurement legislation being fully implemented, I mean, it's passed by the parliament, but it isn't fully operationalized and so on. So in the absence of that, you can procure without the restrictions of the legislation and regulations.
But I mean, these things should be unacceptable in our democracy. We seem to have forgotten that democracy is such a fragile thing, and that we must always set the right precedent, we must always set the right example. And another promise has been made to operationalize the public procurement legislation, and I think end of March again this year.
But they want to, the Minister of Finance says they want to take out government-to-government arrangements and some other things out of what has already been passed.
Yeah.
So this piece of legislation has gone through more than one debate in the parliament and amendment it by the parliament.
Yes.
So they want to come back for a third time and amend it a third time. That's just not on.
Yeah. I hear you on that. But let's talk about some of the more micro issues.
Yes.
The issue of the Dragon deal, the Dragon field deal, gas deal, and so on. And of course, the Minister of Energy was here last week talking about the difference between cross-border and across-the-border type things. So now it has been put out there that this Dragon gas deal may no longer be on the cards, at least not for now.
Yes.
How badly do you think that affects our ability to deal with that gas shortage, that gas deficit at the Point Lisa's industrial estate?
Yeah, well, obviously a lot was being banked on in terms of Dragon. Now, the Dragon field is totally in Venezuelan waters. So that is their gas. But it is what is known as stranded gas because Venezuelans don't have any pipeline facilities or anything like that to take it ashore, nor do they have any processing plants to make use of the gas. So it was going to be a fairly easy thing for Venezuela to put in the platforms, and then a pipeline would link it to one of the platforms that is in Trinidad and Tobago waters.
Right.
And then existing pipelines, of course, taking it from that platform down to Point Lisa's. And so that would have been a shorter process than trying to do exploration for new gas and then putting production platforms, new pipelines, getting it, which takes like 4 or 5 years. So it was hoped that Dragon would have been on stream by this year, maybe 2020, 2021.
Right.
Now, the other factor of Dragon that would have been important for Trinidad and Tobago, if we had gotten it done quickly enough, was that it would have given a little buffer to the government in its negotiations with the multinationals, BHP, Shell, BP, which companies everybody knows, the country, Trinidad and Tobago, is short of gas. Short of gas in the sense that the demand for gas is greater than the supply of gas. Mm-hmm. Now, if I am a supplier and I know that you are in trouble to meet your customers, then I could negotiate in a very strong way. You're in a much weaker position to negotiate. If the Dragon gas was on stream, it would have perhaps given a bit of a buffer to the government in terms of negotiations with the multinationals. That didn't happen. So the U.S. policy of sanctions, which is, in my view, illegitimate, illegal, contrary to all international norms and so on, because unilaterally imposed by the United States, outside of any United Nations decision-making and that kind of thing, purely to achieve regime change, which is a very dangerous thing when a large country says, I don't like you, I don't like your policies, and therefore I'm going to get rid of you by any means, and I could squeeze you because I'm big and I have power in terms of international markets and so on. So, unfortunately, Dragon now cannot be implemented. Now, Dr. Rowley is right in one sense that the agreements that were signed are still legally binding on both governments, yes, being sovereign states, but it can't be implemented given the U.S. sanctions. On the other hand, the Lorraine Manatee gas field, that is now cross-border. Yeah. That is a gas field which is under the sea, but and gas, of course, doesn't recognize international boundaries. Right? So part of that gas field under the sea is located in Trinidad and Tobago waters. The majority of it is in Venezuelan waters. And the original plan was to have the entire field being produced with the gas coming into Trinidad and Tobago. Now, given the dynamics of the situation, what it seems to have happened, and we didn't know this before, that Trinidad and Tobago, together with Shell, I think it is, can now produce that gas in the Trinidad and Tobago percentage then.
Right. So the minister indicated that he estimated around 23% of the entire gas field belongs to Trinidad and Tobago.
Right. So in other words, we could produce up to 23% of what are the proven reserves of gas that are there. But again, that's going to take some time. You have to get in a platform, so they're talking about 4 or 5 years, because these things are not like buying a motor car or buying a, it takes time.
But as you look at the broad macroeconomic spectrum of Trinidad and Tobago and what's happening globally and the factors that are impacting us, what is your view in terms of this era of austerity that we've had to endure? due to the shock impacting the energy sector and so on. Do you see us emerging from this anytime soon?
I don't see us emerging from our economic circumstances of relatively low oil and gas prices. I mean, people say, well, maybe something happens in the Middle East and then prices spike, but they spike and they go back down, as we have seen. In fact, the coronavirus now has forced prices down because they will say that demand in China is falling, et cetera, global trade is falling, airlines can't fly as much, cruise ships can't travel as much, so the demand for energy is going to fall. So we cannot bank on hoping that prices will go up. That's just not on. And our production levels are not good. The refinery was closed down, so that also was a loss in real economic activity in terms of foreign exchange, in terms of jobs, in terms of business activity, particularly in the South and so on, very depressed. So I don't see the economy growing in terms of the size of the national cake. Given current policies, there's no policy decision that has been made that says this project is going to happen or this economic activity is going to pick up, that we're going to see many more tourist arrivals or we're going to see something that changes the dynamic. There's nothing there that is going to change the dynamic. And so we're going to be in this period of economic stagnation, if you wish, my view, for the next 3, 4, 5 years, to use the economic term, all things being equal. Unless something dramatic happens, unless somebody is able to introduce new policies that can work, that are sustainable going forward. And I don't see any of that. Now, on the other hand, the issue of austerity is really an issue that is not necessarily tied to this economic circumstances. Yes, in economic circumstances where the economy has gotten smaller, the national cake has gotten smaller, then the issue now has to be, how do we share that smaller pie amongst all the population in a fair and equitable way? Now, policies of austerity say that we're going to shrink the share for those at the bottom of the income scale, so that the poor and working man and woman, they get less and less, but those at the top don't necessarily suffer from the shrinking pie. In fact, their share of the pie often increases in periods of austerity. And if you look, for example, all over the world, what has been happening with policies of austerity is that in that period of implementation, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
A lot of times, I mean, we talk about, these policies of austerity and how they're intended to stabilize an economy and so on. But yes, the income distribution patterns do worsen. And the issue then becomes, well, how do we protect the more vulnerable in the society? How do we ensure that their lives aren't permanently disrupted to the extent that we now have just a larger and permanent class of poor people in our society? The challenge is always, how do we get the politicians to have the will? Like, for instance, one would say this may not be the best time to increase the minimum wage, but it probably is one of the better times that we can increase the minimum wage so that we can protect the poor. We can protect the more vulnerable in our society, increase social benefits to protect the aged and so on. But these are things that you're not necessarily going to see based on the political dynamics. And that's why I'm saying, how do we get our population to understand that our politicians, via their quality of leadership, really do need to be a lot more courageous at this point in time?
Yeah, that I suppose, if we could answer that question in, then we'd be in a much better place, so that what is offered by the politicians, particularly election time, are short-term fixes. So you will see CPEP numbers being bumped up, URP numbers being bumped up, food cards being shared more easily and so on, and more widely. And so people get, which people need, but it's a short-term gain. Now, the reality is that people on the ground, because in that local government election, I walked around a lot in different areas, people recognize that those really are short-term fixes, and they don't want that. But On the other hand, I think this is a challenge for people like myself and others. How do we offer an alternative that really fires up their imagination? Yes, that really is the key question. And that they recognize that they can take a leap of faith, if you wish, and abandon the old and go with the new, which is what I say is required as a revolution of the mind. Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're going to take a quick break. But when we come back, let's talk about some of the ideas that maybe can excite the population as far as embracing something new.
Yeah.
Change. We'll be right back after this quick break, folks. Don't go anywhere.
Who set these standards in my T&T? Really wish somebody here could tell me.
Welcome back, folks. 24.5 minutes before the hour of 7 o'clock, and we have our traffic cam in Princestown. Do we? Apparently, it's not up. All right. Good morning to the folks in Princestown. I hope that you had a fantastic weekend and you spent some time just enjoying some of our culture. Well, we're speaking with Mr. David Abdulah. He's a political leader of MSJ. Before we went to break, one of the things that I think we need to discuss more are some of the ideas that can really excite the population to embrace a new pathway towards transforming Trinidad and Tobago. If you were to identify maybe one or two things that can excite this population, what might those things be?
Yeah, that's a key question. And right now we're working on our 20 points for 2020, actually, which will be out fairly shortly. Interestingly, because I was in constitutional reform discussions way back then, Spantin myself and others, Olabisi Koboni and others, Michael Theodore, and the issues of constitutional reform don't excite the population unless perhaps there is a proposal by the government where people feel their rights and freedoms will be directly infringed. But to come to forums to discuss constitution, because it seems to be abstracted, it's far removed from their lives, whereas although it does impact directly on their bread and butter, people don't necessarily make the link.
Yes.
So I think that critical is the issue of giving people not only material benefits, which is very important, those who don't have very much, but also a sense of ownership of this country. People don't feel that they have a stake in the country. And if you don't feel you have a stake in the country, then it's going to be very difficult to deal, for example, with the young man who picks up a gun. Because as far as he's concerned, the society has nothing for him.
Yeah.
He doesn't feel that he's a part of, that there's any future for him. So I think it's about giving people hope for the future by showing them how they can be involved in their own development, in their communities.
Okay, so if we were to pick, let's pick education.
Yes.
I say, well, GATE was fantastic while it lasted. And I suppose, you had the good with the bad. But still, a lot of people used it as an important opportunity to advance themselves in life. And that was fantastic. Of course, GATE is expensive, and given the austerity issues, GATE has now been curtailed. Okay, but what might be a great idea for education? What about the SEA issue?
Yeah.
Why are we not talking about the transformation of the SEA? The Barbados PM, Ms. Mia Motley, said that they're going to do something radically different with that secondary entrance examination.
And the reason why the governments have shied away from tackling that is because they have shied away from challenging the Concordat, which says that the denominational schools have the right to have 20% intake in their schools. That is a major challenge. Because to do away with the SCA, you then have to zone people. So wherever you live, that is the school you go to. And so you can't be living in Diego Martin and sending your child to school in Port of Spain when there are secondary schools in Diego Martin. But folks who might be living in Diego Martin, who then have access to Fatima and Convent and CIC and so on, and bishops, will say, no, we don't want that. Similarly, people will not be able to be in Chaguanas and send their children to Sags and Hillview. They will have to go to Chaguanas East or West, as the case may be, and they don't want that. So it is challenging the status quo, not only in terms of the denominational schools, but also the elites in the society who want their children to go to the elite schools. And the problem is that the technocrats, top technocrats and professionals in society, they have an entrenched interest in keeping the education system as it is, because our children have been able to do well in the existing education system.
Right.
The children who are not doing well, they don't have the decision-making influence and power to change the system.
All right, so
So it really is now, that's why we have to challenge that status quo all the time.
But that's the thing, Mr. Abdulah. You see, if we set out to make every government school a high-performing institution, this problem will disappear. It wouldn't matter which school you go to. All that would matter is that you were guided properly as a young person through this process where you would develop all your talents, your skills, and so on, make yourself proud, make your family proud, and so on. That is where we spend billions of dollars in this education system. And yet we can't seem to come to grips with the fact that the government schools are the lowest of the schools on a performance scale.
So the secondary level, yes.
So
yes.
Why haven't we been able to transform that? Maybe that is one of the ideas that can excite this population, that maybe we need to start thinking about long-term policies and not just thinking about short-term bread and butter issues.
Yeah. Yes, I agree 100% about the education system is critical because coming out of CSEC, fifth form, what we probably call CXC, but really is CSEC, fifth form, 50% of our children are routinely failing CSEC or don't even get there. So that means that 7,000 of our young people are every year failing. Now, that can't be that they themselves are failures. It means that the education system is failing them, because no education system should be set up in such a way that such a large number of the children who are going through the school system fail. So we have to transform the education system. When, therefore, you have that large failure rate, you then get psychologically these young people being deemed failures, and their self-esteem, self-confidence, and so on, and some of them have difficulty reading and writing. You then get the tendency for them to get into illegal activity because they don't have any opportunities for employment that is decent going forward.
So let me put the pressure on your shoulders. Political leader of the MSJ, do you think that the MSJ's political fortunes will be greatly enhanced if these transformative ideas become the core focus of the MSJ, that it is about shaking up the status quo. In other words, it's a status quo that is not working for a large segment of our population. That is the kind of transformative thinking that we need. The present administration attempted to work out this deal with Sandals. It didn't work out, and that's all there is to it as far as building a strong tourism sector is concerned. It can't be that. It can't be that.
Correct.
So then, can we hear more from the MSJ with regard to these big ideas, these transformative ideas?
Yeah. And we have already put our education policy out since when? 2013, 2014, I think it was. It's on our website. We were to develop a number of other policy areas. We didn't complete all. Our economic policies have to be changed because that was at a period of very high oil and gas prices.
Yes.
So and a lot has happened since then.
Yes.
So we have to change economic policy in terms of some of the strategies, although some of the core analysis remains obviously the same. The labor policy is there, that remains the same, and a number of other areas. Education, we have a major chapter on education. So yes, and we're going to condense that because those are long policy documents. We're going to condense that into our 20 points for 2020. One transformative issue is the question of how do we deal with the wealth and income inequality. Now, yesterday, I was listening to Pan. The crowd there was, 80%, maybe more, African descendants, right? African Trinbagonians, maybe more than 80%, 85%. And that was, the Pan, the steel band, is a huge asset, as we were discussing earlier with the Carnival and so on, huge asset.
Yes.
Now, how do we leverage the assets that the African population has built up over the years through sacrifice and so on? Hard work and sacrifice.
Yes.
This is saying that Africans are lazy, etc., etc. When I walk along the foothills of the Northern Range from Carnival in the west, going up into the east and so on, people have built communities, built their homes, but most of them don't have title to the land. Right.
But it's no different in Tobago? It's the same kind of dynamic that has happened in Tobago?
In Tobago, though, people can although they don't have the legal documentation is a problem, but they can actually trace their land ownership back many, many generations. Here in Trinidad, it's slightly different, but people have been living on land for renting perhaps from some landowner or in some cases from the state and so on for 100 years.
They've been squatting, yes.
What we would do is to say, all of those people who have been there for so many years and who have actually built their homes through sacrifice, toting gravel and cement and galvanized and lumber on their backs, literally, to build their homes, that they should get title to land, so that if they have a small business, they could then leverage and use that asset to be able to access capital to expand their businesses and so on.
And that's a fantastic idea, but it has to be built around a larger land policy.
Correct.
Successive governments have gone the route of giving letters of comfort and so on, and that it really has not worked to the advantage of the homeowners. And I'm saying to you that this is the kind of conversation that needs to happen on a more regular basis.
Well, I'll share something with you. When there was an Economic Development Advisory Board, we were actually beginning to address the issue of a land and housing policy.
Well, apparently...
Of course, that went the way of all flesh because, again, you see, those who control decision-making, the traditional parties, PNM, UNC, don't want that kind of transformational policies that will change things fundamentally. We were beginning to address the issue of wealth and income inequality in the society. We were looking at the steel drum as a major industry and looking at all of the gaps and weaknesses in the process of developing the steel drum as an industry. So all of that work. So some of it has been done, some of it is still to be done, but it comes back to something you posed earlier. Leadership, vision, courage.
Final question to you this morning, Mr. Abdulah, and this is probably the most important question. If we don't embrace change, transformation, and even if you say, well, we're fed up with talking about change, but let's talk about changing the change then. If we don't, as a society, embrace change, how long can we survive as a nation?
We'll survive, but we'll be descending into more and more barbarism. That's where we're going in terms of the violence, the culture of violence, which is escalating, the sense of people not feeling that this country has any future for them. And I talk to business people too, and they are very unhappy and say, but best we close down and go where our money is. And at another level, our young people, particularly those who have university qualifications, who don't have a job, don't want to work here. If they could get out, they'll go somewhere else. So we are devaluing our society. So we remain a nation, but tremendously devalued. And the potential that we have to provide for everybody in a decent way, we will lose that potential. And it becomes harder and harder because we are digging ourselves deeper and deeper into a hole, and it's harder and harder to get out of it. But perhaps at this moment, as we are in the 50th anniversary of 1972, people will begin to think differently about change.
where will this new hope come from? Who will step forward and offer Trinidad and Tobago a new long-term view of the way forward?
And of course, I could speak subjectively and say we have it, but that's not for us ultimately to be the judge of. Others may come up and so on, but we in the MSJ are attempting to do that as best as we can with our ideas and our track record of listening to people, working with people systematically to bring about change. We are not about overnight solutions. We're not about opportunism and promises, because promises are comfort of food. We're about serious politics.
Mr. Abdulah, thank you for continuing the conversation about change. Thanks. And I certainly do hope we can have many more of these conversations to counteract that status quo that is keeping us in this austere environment. Folks, we're going to run a quick break, and when we return, we have a lot more in store for you.